Welcome to our program. We're talking about when did life originate, where did life originate, how did life originate? And in answering that question, you got to say, where did the first cell come from? My guest is philosopher of science, Dr. Stephen Meyer, who's written this best-selling book, Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design. And in recent days, the discoveries about DNA in the cell, it has formed a very complex picture, so complex that it has led you to posit that the only place it could come from is from an intelligent designer. Talk a little bit about that and what you're finding in DNA.
Well, as we talked about in our last program, DNA encodes digital information. It's a form of digital nanotechnology. And the information in the DNA directs the construction of the proteins and protein machines that are necessary for the cell to stay alive. And this, I think, has reframed the ancient question about design, because in the 19th century, with Darwin's theory, it was thought that he had explained away all evidence of design. And now we have a striking appearance of design that has no, at this point, naturalistic explanation. And I think there's also a positive reason to think that it was designed by an intelligence. But it's interesting, I think, for our purposes, at this point, just to acknowledge that this is a huge mystery. I call it the DNA enigma. Richard Dawkins, who denies that there's any evidence of design, nonetheless has to acknowledge that DNA is full of digital code. He says that the machine code of the genes is uncannily computer-like. Bill Gates goes on to say that DNA is like a software program, only much more complex than any we've ever created. So what we're dealing with inside the cell is information, and that raises a really profound mystery, because we know we need information to build all the important components of the cell. So if you want to explain the origin of the first cell, the origin of life, you have to account for the origin of information. And there's a German scientist named Bernd Olaf Küppers who acknowledged this connection early on. He said that the question of the origin of life is basically equivalent to the question of the origin of biological information. And that makes sense too, because I used to ask my students a question: if you want to give your computer a new function, what do you have to give it? And they would know right away. You got to give it code, information, software. And the same thing is true in life. There's a connection between information and new form and function. And if you want to get a functional living organism off the ground, you got to have that information. So that's the DNA enigma. That's the big mystery that has to be solved.
And it's a lot of information. It's not just a few things. It's a lot of things in a lot of different parts that are all programmed to work together. It's very complex.
It's lines and lines of code. I mean, in the human genome, you've got 3 billion characters. In lower animals, somewhat less, but it's an amazing amount of information in every living organism.
Now, folks, we have trillions of cells in our bodies, okay? Each one of them have DNA in it. And DNA is doing a specific function in the cell that's fantastic. And I want you to describe it for the folks the best that you can here.
Well, DNA is special for 2 reasons. We're aware of its amazingly beautiful double helix structure. We see the double helix as almost an icon now in culture. We see it on news programs about criminal investigations. But the thing that people typically overlook about DNA is that it's chock full of information. In fact, information that's stored in a digital form. So it's very much like a software program in that you have very specific arrangements of chemicals along the spine of the DNA that function just like alphabetic characters in a written language or digital zeros and ones in a machine code. So it's information carrying capacity or information storage capacity that's really important. Now, the information in DNA ends up directing the construction of proteins and protein machines. When we were together in the last program, I used the analogy of what goes on at the Boeing plant up in Seattle where I live, where engineers will use digital information to direct the construction of mechanical parts. For example, an airplane wing where you place the rivets will all be controlled by machinery that's being directed by digital information that's flowing down the line. That's exactly what's going on inside the cell. You've got digital code directing the construction of mechanical parts. And that raises a huge question, which is, where does all that information in the cell come from? We know where it comes from at Boeing. It's designed by engineers, but where does it come from inside the cell?
Talk a little bit more about what that information is like. It's not just complex information, it's specific information.
Very good. Let me give just a little bit of a science lesson here. There are two different definitions of information that engineers and scientists and ordinary people are familiar with. In the engineering world, there's something called Shannon information, or it's a mathematical formula that describes how much information can be carried along an information channel. So it's sometimes called information carrying capacity. And the mathematical definition of information only captures a part of what we typically mean by information. It just refers to the improbability of a sequence of characters. The more improbable an arrangement of characters, the more information is being conveyed.
Yeah, it's like an alphabet where you just have gibberish. You got a lot of letters, but
Right.
it doesn't do anything.
So look at for example, on this slide you have at the top, I, U, I, N, S, K. The gibberish string is an information carrying channel. It could be arranged to convey information, but we don't know whether it's functional or non-functional. We don't know whether it's conveying any meaning. But we can still calculate how improbable that exact string is, and that's all the mathematical theory of information does. It calculates the information carrying capacity, but it doesn't tell us whether the information is functional or specifically arranged to convey a function.
Yeah, and DNA has the second
It
one.
has the second type of information, and here I use an English analogy with tide in time, wait for no man. A clearly functional string of characters that is conveying information that is meaningful. Okay. Now, there's some terminology that goes with this. The top string is said to be complex, but it's not said to be specified in complex. In mathematical parlance, complexity and improbability are the same idea. So the more improbable, the more complex something is. But DNA isn't just complex. It's not just an improbable arrangement of characters. It's specified and complex, just like English language or computer code is specified and complex. So when we talk about the DNA enigma, the mystery surrounding the origin of the information you need to build the first cell, we're not just talking about information in the mathematical sense of improbability, like the first line in the slide to my right. Instead, we're talking about information that is specified. The arrangement of characters matters to the function the string of characters performs. And that's what we have in DNA. And Francis Crick made that point very early on when he said he was aware of the mathematical theory of information. He said, when we're talking about information in DNA, we're not talking about merely mathematical information, merely Shannon information, as it's called by engineers. We're talking about specified information or functional information. And here he says, information means here the precise determination of the sequence, either of the bases in the DNA or the amino acids in the proteins. Those subunits of those important molecules have to be specifically arranged to perform the jobs that they do inside cells.
All right, Stephen, people in the audience are probably asking the question, so what that it's arranged precisely? So what that the sequence is there? If it wasn't there, what would that mean? The cell would be dead, basically, wouldn't it?
Well, right, because the information in the DNA molecule provides the instructions for building new proteins. And the proteins are the toolbox of the cell. They do all the important jobs that keep the cell alive. So if you don't get if you have the wrong sequence of bases in DNA, you won't build a functional protein. When we were together last time, I used a visual aid, and I'll bring it up again if you don't mind. It gets across. These are snap block blocks, but I use them to illustrate how proteins are constructed. Proteins are long chain-like molecules. They're made of smaller chemical subunits called amino acids. Each of the beads here represents one of the different 20 different types of amino acids. If DNA sends a signal, sends information that tells the cell the sequence in which it is to attach one amino acid after another. If the amino acids are attached properly, then the chain will fold into a three-dimensional structure that will have a hand-in-glove fit with other molecules in the cell and will allow the chain to do the job it needs to do. So if you get the sequence right of the bases on the DNA, then you'll get the correct sequence of amino acids, which will cause it to fold properly and which will enable it to perform a function.
All right, you've discovered all of that, which brings up the question, where in the world did this information come from? How did it get there in the first place? Because the information, as we're going to see, is absolutely enormous and complex. I mean, you could have 150 of those amino acids in just a regular protein.
That's just a short protein.
You could have 1,000 or more in the bigger proteins, and they've all got to be arranged in the right order. So what are the theories that are being proposed here to answer the question, how did this start off?
This is the question that fascinated me because I became intrigued with what I call the DNA enigma. The enigma is not what does DNA do, We know that, but the question is, where did the information that DNA stores, where does that information come from in the first place? And there have been a number of completely naturalistic or materialistic theories that have been proposed, and they've been kind of nicely summarized by a French scientist. His name was Jacques Monod. He wrote a book in 1968. He was one of the colleagues of Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of DNA. And Monod wrote a book saying that if you're going to be a scientist and you want to explain something, you've got some basic approaches to explanation that you need to try or to stick to. One is to rely on chance, on random variations of some kind. Another is to rely on what he called necessity, which is a kind of scientific code word for relying on natural laws. If I drop a ball and it falls to the earth, a scientist would say it falls by necessity, according to the law of gravity. And Monod said there's also a third approach which combines chance variations with law-like processes of necessity. That's kind of what Darwin did in combining natural selection and random variations. And he says that's an acceptable scientific approach too. So if you're addressing the question of the origin of life from a naturalistic or materialistic point of view, you want to explain the origin of life by either chance, necessity, or the combination of the two. And as I investigated the DNA enigma, I kind of followed that logic and said, okay, how have those different approaches to explaining the origin of information fared? Have they been successful in accounting for this great mystery? Or is the mystery even deeper than we maybe realize? And I came to the latter conclusion.
Yeah. How many of you listening heard that life arose by chance or by chance and natural selection? All right? If you heard that and you're still persuaded of that, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to unscramble that and we're going to show you what are the chances that it could happen by chance. All right? Stick with us. We'll be right back. All right, we're back. We're talking with Dr. Stephen Meyer, a philosopher of science who has written a best-selling book. Here it is, Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design. And we're answering the question, how did life originate? Where did the first cell come from? And now we're talking about what are the naturalistic theories that have been proposed to answer this question. Where did the specified information in the DNA molecule come from? How did it get there? And one of the deals is by chance, and you've got a quote there that kind of tells where the folks are at on this.
This was from a famous biochemistry textbook. It was written in the 70s, and this, it kind of summarized what a lot of people had in mind. It's from Albert Leninger, the author. He says, "We now come to the critical moment in evolution in which the first semblance of life appeared through the chance association of a number of abiotically formed macromolecular components."
What does that mean?
Well, in English, it just means that all those parts of the DNA molecule that we were seeing in the previous segment and the parts of the protein arrange themselves by chance into the informational arrangements, the informational sequences that are necessary for those molecules to perform the functions they do in cells. I wouldn't say it was a full-blown approach. It was kind of assumed by a lot of scientists early on that chance would solve the problem. I've actually been criticized in the book for taking that proposal too seriously. Most scientists now believe that chance is completely inadequate for explaining the origin of the information you need to build the first life.
All right, so let's talk about this thing. Why is it that it couldn't have happened by chance?
Well, you can never say never for sure, okay? You can't say something couldn't for sure, but you can say that it would be vastly more improbable than not that life arose by chance. So improbable, in fact, that people would dismiss it as being not a credible hypothesis.
And I think the folks, when they hear what you're going to say, are
let me explain why. Here's an illustration I used to use with my students. I've got a little bag here of Scrabble letters. So I asked my students to test the hypothesis that chance is an effective way of building new information, of generating new information. What I'd have them do is I'd have them walk up to, or I'd walk out into the aisles, have them pick out letters at random, and then take those letters and go and write whatever letter they chose on the blackboard, and have them do it in the sequence that they
picked out of the bag,
in which they chose the letters. And invariably, what would turn up on the blackboard would be some gibberish like Z, S, U, A, E, T, whatever, and obviously improbable arrangement of characters, but not specified to perform a function, not meaningful, okay? And that's the problem with chance. It generates unspecified arrangements, but not specified arrangements.
Yeah, you got gibberish versus time and tide wait for no man.
Exactly, and chance does a great job of giving you the gibberish, but it will not. It does not produce information. Now, occasionally we'd have a situation in which we'd get a student. Maybe the first 3 students would come up with something like bin or or something that was at least word-like, and the students would often start to kind of do cat calls and say, see, we got you. We're gonna produce a lot of information by chance. But I would always win the argument by allowing the experiment to keep going, and eventually the gibberish would completely swamp the meaningful any hint of meaning that was in.
Yeah, if you had 150 letters going down the line, the fact is you'd have gibberish.
Yeah, absolutely, and there's a reason for that, and I've got a little demonstration on that point as well. It's called the problem of combinatorials, and this is what people don't realize. Before we get to the slide, I have a visual aid. Okay, it's a little dinosaur puzzle, and it's got 4 dials. On each dial, there are 6 possibilities, 1 for each of 6 dinosaurs, and you've got a dial for the head, the torso, the tail, and the label of each dinosaur. And the idea here in the puzzle is you're trying to turn it to get the Tyrannosaurus Rex head, body, tail, and label all to line up. Now, what are the odds of doing that by just turning the dials at random? That's the problem of combinatorials. There's lots of different combinations, so the odds are actually very small. You've got a 1 in 6 chance of getting the correct head. Now and then a 1 in 6 chance of getting the correct body, tail, and label. And you might want to say the odds are 6 plus 6 plus 6 plus 6, but that's not how it works, because you have to take into account all the different combinations that can be formed. If I've got a head on one label, 1 in 6 possibility here, but on the second dial for the torso, I've also got a 1 in 6 possibility. So there's actually 6 times 6 possibilities. And then when you get to the third dial, you get another times 6, and the fourth dial, another times 6. It ends up that you actually have 1,296 possible combinations. So the odds of getting the correct one are only 1 in 1,296. Now, if I say give you 10 seconds and you get to turn the dial 3 times, is it more likely or less likely than not that you will stumble onto the correct combination? Well, it's obviously less likely than not. And it's not impossible, but it's far more likely that you won't solve the problem by chance than you will solve the problem by chance.
But there, you're just starting to show us your combination.
Right, and this is the same problem that applies to the origin of life. If you want to, well, and I got one more illustration. You got a bike lock. Got 10 now, instead of 6 possibilities on each dial, you've got 10, and you've got 4 possibilities. Now you've got 10,000 possible combinations. What if you had a bike lock with 10 dials? Now you've got 10 times 10 times 10 times 10, 10 to the 10th possibilities, or 10 trillion combinations. If you're a thief and you're trying to steal a bike and it's got that kind of a lock on it, you're going to be spinning dials till the cows come home, and you're never going to hit the right combination. There's just too many combinations to search. The odds are always going to be against you. It's always going to be more likely than not that you won't solve the problem by chance, vastly more. Now, in the case of proteins, it's even much worse, because you have 20 possibilities at each site, and you don't just have 10 sites. For a very modest short protein of, say, 150 amino acids, you've got an enormous number of combinations. So you've got, for this is a short protein, 150 amino acids long. You've got 20 times 20 times 20 times 20 to the 150th power. Converting that into base 10, that's 1 chance in 10 to the 95th power of getting a specific sequence. Now, in my book, I go into this in more detail.
What's that number like?
Well, there's only 10 to the 80th elementary particles in the whole universe. There's only been 10 to the 17th seconds since the origin of the universe, assuming a 13 billion year old universe. This is an unimaginably large space. So the best way to get a handle on it is to imagine something like we're looking for a needle in a haystack. Only the haystack is the size of the galaxy, or maybe the universe, and the needle is somewhere out there, and you've got 10 seconds to look. And it's such a small fraction of time in relation to all those possibilities that the odds are still like the thief with the bike lock, or me with the dinosaur puzzle. It's always vastly more likely than not that you're going to solve the problem by chance.
Yeah. All right, Steve, what do you want our audience to come away with from this program? What's the bottom line?
Well, the bottom line is that chance is not a plausible explanation for the origin of the DNA enigma, the origin of the information necessary to build the first life. In the book, I make a very precise calculation that takes into account a number of different factors, more than we've been able to discuss here. But the number I come up with shows that it's always more likely that life did not arise by chance than it did, which is another way of saying there's always a better explanation than the chance explanation. And so maybe next time we can look at some of those other proposed explanations. But universally, within the field of origin of life studies, scientists have rejected the idea that chance alone produced the first life.
Hi, folks, we're just getting started. Next week, we're going to turn to the question, when this information was discovered, and it's even getting more complex than what we showed them right here, those who did not want to take the intelligent design side had to come up with a naturalistic theory of how this information got there at the beginning. And we've already talked about chance. And what you're saying is all of the scientists now have rejected chance. What have they turned to? What are the next two theories? We'll talk about that next week, folks. You won't want to miss it.